Morning, everybody.
Recording in progress.
So winter has returned to Bloomington. You're all an intrepid band to be out here in winter weather. Once again, as we continue our trip through the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination.
Did you turn on the...
How about if I turn on the microphone? Maybe that would be a good plan. There we go. How's that?
That's good.
Okay. So today we are taking up Gate 95 of the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. And that gate says, to teach and guide living beings is a gate of Dharma illumination, for we ourselves neither indulge pleasures nor become tired. So I've talked before here with these gates about what we mean by teaching and guiding living beings, but just quick review. This kind of teaching is not intellectual teaching. This is not like book study. The feeling of this particular word is helping someone or some being to transform. So the idea is that the Bodhisattva works to transform other beings, deluded, suffering beings, into Bodhisattvas like himself or herself, right? So Bodhisattvas are transforming beings into other Bodhisattvas. So this is the kind of teaching and guiding that we're talking about. So this kind of teaching specifically includes demonstrating, embodying, physically manifesting something, right? Showing a form. Sometimes we have to make something concrete, right? Before we really begin to understand it and before we can show that to others. There's something about experiencing something perhaps with the body or demonstrating something with the body. So teaching and guiding living beings is how we move through the world as bodhisattvas, carrying out bodhisattva vow, right? So this is our kind of moment by moment moving through the world. How are we with people? What are we doing? It's just doing the day-to-day work of liberating beings by embodying our practice in a really practical way, right? Somebody's hands are full, you help them carry something, right? Somebody trips and falls, you help them up. It's just the very small things we do every day that embody this bodhisattva vow. This is about keeping precepts, right? Whether or not we've formally taken precepts and are wearing something that says we've made that kind of public commitment, there's something about just keeping precepts in our day-to-day, moment by moment, moving through the world. Also embracing, engaging in the four embracing actions. We've been talking about Bodhisattva Shishobo quite a bit here lately. We're about to have a whole practice period with this thing as a theme. So simply engaging in giving and loving speech and beneficial action and identity action is also a part of this thing. So what are we bringing to the world in a very concrete moment by moment way? It's about just being wise and compassionate in dealing with other beings, friends, family, people we like, people we don't like so much, people we don't know very well, human beings and non-human beings. What about the non-human beings in our universe that we encounter? So all of that is part of this teaching and guiding living beings. So sometimes we're teaching directly, sometimes we're simply leading by example. So maybe we're giving some direct advice, or somebody says, what is this thing you do about sitting in front of a wall, and can you tell me about this? Maybe our friends and family want to know that. Maybe it's simply what example we set in the world, how we engage with what we encounter. So in that way, we're all Dharma teachers, right? We're all bodhisattvas. Doesn't matter if we're wearing something that says that. We're doing that anyway. So we don't need to wait for a public ceremony. We don't need to wait for a special status to simply bring our practice to our day-to-day lives, our day-to-day moving through the world. So that means Dharma teaching and support is flowing back and forth among all the nodes of a network that we call Sangha, or that we call a practice community. So this is not a pyramid. It's not top down. On Sundays, somebody sits in this seat. Might be you, somebody sits in this seat, right? But the next week it's somebody else. And the next moment we're looking at somebody else. So this is not a pyramid kind of thing. This is Dharma flowing amongst all the nodes of this network that we call Sangha. This is one reason why it's important that we actually show up here and practice as a community. Because when we're all here practicing together, that flowing, that interconnection is happening in a way that we can experience in a different kind of way. So if we think it's not important whether we show up on Sunday or Wednesday night or Monday morning or sometime in the Zendo, right? We're enabling other beings to practice. Even if it's you in the Jikido, You know, you're enabling other beings to practice simply by showing up and contributing that spirit. So it's kind of, I kind of think of it like the parachute game. Maybe you've seen the parachute game where everybody's around the outside of a parachute, holding the edge of that cloth, and you synchronize movements to sort of lift it up and down, or to rotate it, or you lift it up and somebody's running underneath, right? There's this whole set of activities that you can do as a group. Maybe it's a school or a camp or a work group where you're getting to know each other, right? So the parachute is round. Nobody's at the head of this thing, right? Everyone's equidistant from the middle. Everyone's got their hands on this thing. Everyone's moving together. There's no head of the line, right? Everybody's participating equally. So somebody might be explaining what's happening, right? But everybody is lifting that parachute up and down and rotating it and doing whatever that activity is. So everyone's keeping an even tension with everybody else. If you drop your part, it's going to fall to the floor. So there's an evenness about that, right? There's an equality of participation and something like that. So we're all holding up our piece of the Dharma parachute, right? When we come together and practice, and even when we're not all physically together, each of us is holding up our little piece of that Dharma parachute, lifting it up and down, right? Moving it around with our bodies and minds. We kind of hope we're in sync with each other. Something's happening there. We're responding to what others are doing to keep that game going. So if I'm moving with my little piece of the parachute, the person next to me is also moving with their little piece of the parachute. That's how we keep the game going. So just sort of thinking about that, seeing somebody with the parachute and just thinking about that or deciding not to play creates a problem, right? Does not help beings transform. Somehow we're separate. We're holding ourselves out here. So the parachute is just going to lie there unless we, hold on to our corner of this thing. So full-on, wholehearted participation in this one unified reality is what we do, moment by moment, right? Sometimes that participation takes the form of activity. There's movement, there's busyness, there's talking, there's, walking around in the world, there's doing activity. Sometimes that participation takes the form of rest and stillness and just being quiet and settling down. And doing that does not mean we're not actively participating. So resting is still wholehearted participation. It's not being cut off. That stillness is not cut off. There's no separation there. So this balance between activity and non-activity is the intersection that this Gates statement is engaging with. So within Sanshin style, this is the element I sometimes call balancing peace and progress. That's my shorthand, balancing peace and progress. This is where we start taking practice off the cushion and trying to understand the significance of our zazen and study in this modern daily life. This is a very, very old practice. And, sometimes we look like we've been around for a few hundred years. So how do we take this practice off the cushion, out through the Zendo door, into the world, in this modern life full of cell phones and chat bots and all kinds of things that we deal with and things that we encounter? So we live with this tension, right, every day, between chasing after things, escaping from things, active, and avoiding taking any action at all because we want to protect this peace of mind. I'm not going to engage in things because I want to maintain my equanimity, or I want to maintain my sort of inner peace, or whatever we kind of call that. So our practice of Zazen teaches us, how do we take that necessary wise action, compassionate action, without stirring up our delusion, stirring up our attachments and three poisonous minds and all that stuff, right? In the midst of all that activity, how do we do that and not cling to stuff, create hindrances or indulge in our hindrances? So we get all those teachings from Uchiyama Roshi, right? That should sound pretty familiar to us here. For him, this was not an abstract theoretical problem, which was somewhere out there. It comes from his experience as a Japanese in a changing society in the time in which he lived. So if we go back before that, in the Tokugawa era, which is 1600 to 1868, roughly, Japan was closed to outside influences. So the social classes were fixed. There was a centralized government that was holding power. The size of the population was stable. There was not much change happening. There was not much upheaval. So fixed social classes meant there wasn't so much competition. There also wasn't so much freedom of choice. People were not worried about these things. Stable population does not need all these advances in agriculture to feed more and more and more and more people, or to figure out how are we going to house more and more people, or take care of more and more people. Without competition, there's peace of mind. There's serenity. There's a relative degree of stability, right? So instead of putting energy into that kind of development and progress, the energy went into refining the culture. So increasingly becoming more sophisticated, elevating aesthetics, right? That's where the attention and the energy went. Then during the Meiji era, which is the next one, 1868 to 1912, Japan begins to be influenced by Western ideas. And these are ideas about organization and government and science and technology and, right, progress. So it has to study and adopt these Western forms of progress so it doesn't get left behind or made into some kind of Western colony, right, that can't keep up. So all of that's great, but peace of mind kind of got lost as a result of that. Now the focus is all on research and development and progress and right? So what happens to peace of mind? So Uchiyama Roshi was born at the beginning of the Taisho era. So he was born in 1912. And he saw what was going on. He lived with the effects of this rapid kind of change in his society. So this experience prompts him to ask a question and to practice with this question. How do we find a balance between progress on the one hand and peace of mind on the other? So this is very real for him. So he thought about how Japan was going to integrate this kind of very serene, stable, traditional, peaceful culture with this more driven kind of Western development, right? How do these things coexist? So he studied Western philosophy, he studied Christianity, he studied Buddhism, trying to come up with an answer, with an understanding for himself. How do you live in the midst of all of that, in that intersection? So he concludes that the Bodhisattva path, working hard for all beings rather than just for yourself, is the answer, right? So what we do is look out and try to help all beings as opposed to being only concerned with this one. So I think this is exactly what this Gates statement is saying. And we'll come back to this at the end, right? But you look at this Gates statement, the pieces start to come together, right? So first let's look at the elements in the second half of the Gates statement. So again, to teach and guide living beings is a gate of Dharma illumination, for we ourselves neither indulge pleasures nor become tired. So let's look at the first one. We can see this balance of activity and movement with rest and non-activity, right? Indulge pleasures, become tired. But this is pointing to something rather specific. So indulging pleasures here is pointing to the pleasures that come through the discrimination we make with the five senses. So last week, Hojo-san talked about how contact between senses and sense objects gives rise to our perception of things and our compulsion to label things as pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and then we're off to the races, right? Then we start writing stories and grasping things, and like all kinds of things happen. So this gate is not saying that everything pleasant is bad. It's not saying we should avoid being happy and comfortable. It's not referring here to things like sympathetic joy or appreciating things in our lives and things in our practice. It's not saying we have to live a really kind of sour life. It's saying we have to be careful about getting caught up in picking, choosing, chasing, running away, So even more specific, the kanji here are pointing to keeping the third precept, which is about not indulging in sexual greed, which is really interesting. Historically, this usually meant male monks not chasing after the women. In this time and place, it typically means something else for us in this kind of context. It's still a relevant precept, but we have to shift our perception of it a little bit, our practice of it a little bit. So originally, this was a teaching about the impurity of the body, right? Somehow this body was impure. We had to suppress it or get rid of it or do something about this body because this was going to be the source of our hindrance and delusion. The point was to move on from this human realm, to leap off the wheel of samsara, to land in nirvana somehow, to get somewhere else in a better situation. And this body was a barrier. This body was a hindrance. So in a different time and culture, we practice differently with this precept, but it's still an instruction, if you will, to consider purity and impurity and what is that? What does that mean? So Sex in itself, not a bad thing. If it was, all of us bodhisattvas here would be here as the result of something bad. So clearly that's not the teaching, right? That's not where this is going. The problem is unhealthy attachment, right? Engaging with the other person solely to meet the needs of the small self. So we're going to, involve ourselves in a relationship purely for, what can I get out of it? So expecting that activity, expecting that person to give you everything you need to be happy and satisfied and content forever and ever. So this is about managing three poisons, right? Greed, anger, and ignorance. It's the three poisons that make something impure. So we're greedy for certain kinds of experiences. That clinging makes us dependent. We're only okay if we can have certain things or do certain things or experience certain things. Otherwise, something's not okay, this small self says, right? So of course that's a problem because of impermanence. If we're clinging to something, relying on this thing for every happy, satisfying, wonderful experience, or to be whole people, or to somehow be okay, we know that's a problem because everything's going to change. This thing we're clinging to is going to change. This person's going to change. We're going to change. Everything's going to change. So that kind of clinging we know is going to create suffering. That person or belonging or whatever we're attached to is going to break or die or leave or go away or something. And then where are we? So it makes for unhappy relationships. So we can tell ourselves it's all because, it's because I love this person so much. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Isn't that an outward-facing thing? Isn't that not about me? I'm doing everything. I'm attached to this person. I'm engaged in this relationship because I really, really love this person so much. So how can that be about my own ego? Well, do we really want the best for that person? Do we want what we want, which is all of our desires kind of gratified and satisfied? So is this really, are we really acting in the best interests of the other person, in the best interest of ourselves? If we're chasing after sex in some unskillful way, it's probably because we've built up some series of ideas about what these five skandhas are. What is their relationship to everything else? That's the karma of our habituated thinking, right? So sex is just one of the human appetites that can keep us distracted, keep us agitated. It could be sex, but it could be food. It could be a powerboat. It could be anything we're right, clinging to, attached to. We might think we're kind of helpless in the face of the things that the human body needs. Well, this is coming straight from the human body. What can I do about it? I'm kind of helpless in the face of my karma as a human being with a body and mind. But Uchiyama Roshi says something really interesting. You come into contact with people who irritate you every day. Finally, you cannot bear it any longer and explode with anger, or you hold in your chronic discontent and make yourself crazy. When there is a person who bugs you, it's not only because he exists, but also because of your conditioned point of view. We must understand this thoroughly. If we have a good appetite, delicious food attracts our attention. If we feel sexual desire, the opposite sex attracts our attention. In other words, only when appetite and sexual desire exist will the world responding to those conditions appear before us. When Naishki, the individual life force called I, arises, the world which I see, according to my conditioned consciousness, will appear, and seeing it, I pursue or flee from the objects that I perceive in it. So, if we're really clear about what these five skandhas are, we're better able to see our habituated thinking and the basis for what we're doing, right? It's really interesting. He says, when we feel sexual desire, the opposite sex attracts our attention, and then we have these conditions. Because of our appetite, the world responding to our conditions appears. So to see through that, right, to see what's going on, where does that happen? Well, Zazen is one place, right? Zazen is one place that can happen. We can drop our ideas about what the small self is demanding, because it feels like it's demanding, right? We can drop our ideas. We can see interconnectedness. And I think it's a chance to be honest with ourselves, right? You're on the cushion facing the wall, man. There's nowhere to run. We really get to see what's coming up. We sort of can't avoid it. We might not like it. We might not want to see it. But in Zazen, we can drop all the distraction and all the stuff we use to avoid looking at what's really coming up here. what these 5 skandhas are really doing, what the 3 poisons, how the 3 poisons are really coming up, right? We really get to be honest with ourselves. I kind of think that's one of the toughest parts of Zazen. I mean, yeah, my back hurts, yeah, my knees are bad, okay, but I think often in Zazen, the hardest thing is to really stay with things coming up that we're not so sure we want to see, right? So Hojo-san picks up where Uchiyama Roshi leaves off. He says, when the 3 wheels of body, speech, and mind are pure, in other words, not driven by 3 poisons, right? We don't take action based on the thoughts coming from our karmic consciousness. This creates a tiny space that allows us to step back and see that we don't need to be driven by our ideas and emotions. Our body, speech, and thought are not defiled by the karmic consciousness that comes from our past experience. When we encounter objects, they don't become objects of our desire. When we meet people, we no longer calculate how useful or helpful they are to ourselves in reaching our goals, and we have fewer problems with others. We see that people and things don't exist for the sake of fulfilling our own desires. They have their own reasons for being. Of course, we have to take care of our desires, but we can see each and everything as Buddha Dharma, right? We open that little bit of space and see what's going on. So it's interesting how we find ourselves, every person we meet, we find ourselves calculating. What can this person do for me? And when I read this, I immediately laugh at myself, because any of you that have any kind of boardsmanship skill, as soon as you arrived here and I said, what do you do for a living and what's your field of endeavor and what are you interested in? I may have grabbed you and said, how would you like to be a board member? What can you do for me, right? So we got to be careful about that stuff. I hope I was seeing the whole person, but I'm reminded of that kind of dynamic when I read this. So being free from attachment is what helps sort of keep us from getting worked up and demanding things in our lives, whether what we're demanding is realistic or not, right? Sometimes those demands are not realistic, and we still want to fulfill them in some way, whether or not that makes sense. It also keeps us from giving up, right? From being full of despair, from really being discouraged, and getting to the point where we really can't do anything. So that brings us to the second element, right? Becoming tired. We've all been tired in this practice. No one's ever sat sesshin without becoming tired. To teach and guide living beings is a gate of Dharma illumination, for we ourselves neither indulge pleasures nor become tired. So Sawaki Roshi said, the reason we human beings are often exhausted is that we do things with personal profit in mind. So when we're attached to an outcome, then we have a yardstick. Here's the thing that I need to have happen. I need it to happen. Here's my yardstick that says I was successful or not. So either I made it or I didn't. Either I was successful or I wasn't successful. Either I worked hard enough and tried hard enough, or somehow I didn't and fell down on the job. So if not, that feels like loss, right? When the losses pile up, we get fatigued, we get tired, we get discouraged, we give up, we just say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to stop moving. So if there's no yardstick, if there's no competition, as Uchiyama Roshi was saying, then there's no basis for this feeling of loss, this feeling of defeat, right? As soon as we hold up a yardstick, there's a chance for defeat. So Uchiyama Roshi says, true religion takes no notice of the human desire to make things profitable for ourselves or of our calculating measurement. If we throw away our ordinary expectations and take an attitude of settling down on whichever side of the balance we fall, it is right there that a truly peaceful life unfolds itself. Doing Zazen is to stop being an ordinary person. So an ordinary person is living by karma rather than living by vow. Ordinary person is getting dragged around by karmic circumstances. The other side of that is the bodhisattva lives by vow. Bodhisattva says, I'm working to save all beings. So he's not saying we should not have direction in our lives. He's not saying we should not work to improve things for ourselves or for others, right? It would be easy to take this as meaning, well, we shouldn't have any kind of goal. We shouldn't have any kind of direction, any kind of objective. But, how can we live in that way? The bodhisattva can't live that way. We'd have a hard time even getting on a cushion, even though Zazen is good for nothing. So he's saying we throw away our expectations of personal profit with whatever this is that we're doing. Because as we know, suffering happens when we want things to be different than they are. So Can we do our best? Can we make good effort? Can we not cling to expectations about the outcome? That's really tough, right? It's one thing when I'm not clinging to an outcome about me, but what if my aspiration, my desire, my direction is to save all beings, and then I hold a yardstick up to that, right? That's not my personal, maybe, my personal kind of goal, but still, how do we continue to make effort without a yardstick? So elsewhere, Sawaki Roshi says, human beings put I into everything without knowing it. We sometimes say, that was really good. What's it good for? It's just good for me, that's all. We usually do things expecting some personal profit. And if the results turn out different from our hidden agenda, we feel disappointed and exhausted. So when we're feeling this persistent fatigue, right, it may be time to stop and look at how we're measuring what we're calling success. Am I continuing to throw myself at the wall? Not this kind of wall. Am I continuing to try to go forward in some way which is not reasonable or is attached to my own personal something, right? I keep trying to do this thing or get this thing for myself, and I keep falling short somehow. It's not fair, right? And we can feel discouraged. So we need to have direction. We need to have aspiration. We would never take any action at all if we didn't have that. But how are we forming those goals? How are we deciding what to aim at? How much of our ego is tied up in that process? And it's very difficult to divorce our ego from that, right? Is there a hidden agenda, as Sawaki Roshi says, that may be causing this fatigue? So it's important not to misunderstand this teaching and to think that mortification of the body is somehow part of our practice, that never resting, never sleeping, ignoring the kind of physical fatigue and even mental fatigue we can have, like somehow that's what we're doing. That's not what we're doing. It's not healthy. Being constantly sleep deprived, being constantly overworked, too busy to take care of our own lives. It's not good for our well-being. It's not balanced, right? That's not what this practice is about. We shouldn't be ignoring or minimizing that stuff. If we are truly suffering from fatigue, we need to take a step back and deal with it. So he's not saying we ignore that stuff. He's saying we look carefully at where it comes from. So we can compare ordinary beings living by karma, getting pulled around by karma, to bodhisattvas or with bodhisattvas who are living by vow. And we know when we take the bodhisattva vow, we're never going to come to the end of that. We're never going to reach the goalpost, right? As Hojo-san always says, it takes longer than forever. So here we're taking this vow. Impossible to set a goal point. Therefore, impossible to set a yardstick. So here's this thing we vowed to do. We're never going to get to the end of it. We could work our whole lives and more than our lives to do this thing. And yet somehow we don't hold a yardstick up to that activity. I'm pretty sure nobody here ever says, dang, I only saved 17 beings this week and my goal was 23. Right? I mean, we just don't measure that. So when we look at how that works, and then we look at how it works to be an ordinary person pulled around by karma, we go, isn't that interesting? We hold a yardstick up to one of these things, but we don't hold the yardstick up to the other one. I think that's kind of interesting. Typically, we don't feel disappointed and exhausted when we're thinking about liberating beings. Maybe we do sometimes if we're working for something really big. But somehow, the measurement is not the same. So I think that's kind of useful. So this Gates statement is intersecting teaching and guiding living beings with not getting on the roller coaster of indulging sense pleasures on the one hand and being tired and inactive on the other. So we've kind of got 2 or 3 things being intersected here. That should sound pretty familiar to us, actually, as descendants of Uchiyama Roshi. It sounds just like his ZZ diagram, right? If you look in the Opening the Hand of Thought book, he's got the line ZZ for Zazen, and he's got thinking and sleeping and thinking and sleeping and thinking and sleeping. And he says this is what we do all the time. We sort of wobble back and forth. In Zazen, we're aiming for this kind of non-thinking, which is not dead, nothing happening here. Non-thinking is we're not engaging with thinking, right? So we're aiming for non-thinking, and we're wobbling between thinking and sleeping and thinking and sleeping. So Dogen calls it dullness and distraction. In the Kanzu Zengi, dullness and distraction are struck aside. So this also sounds like his investigation of balancing peace and progress, right? Thinking, sleeping, progress, peace, progress, peace. Somehow we keep seeing this thread, we keep seeing this theme. How do we balance this activity and stillness? So progress can encourage competition. The result of competition is a few winners and a lot of losers. And winners somehow have power and money and sit at the top of the pyramid. But we know there are no real winners because achieving that kind of power and money and whatever leads to suffering, right? We're afraid we're going to lose it. There goes peace of mind. So is that really the way to sort of a long-term lasting kind of contentment and stability? So he says if we turn our efforts to working for all beings, benefit and development of all beings, rather than competing just for the gains of this small self, satisfying and gratifying, right? All the small self things, then we harness the energy of that kind of discovery and innovation and building for the creation of wholesomeness for all the beings we encounter, right? Liberation from suffering for everybody, which is really what the Bodhisattva kind of path is about. So his conclusion is the best way to navigate these two sides is to walk the Bodhisattva path and work hard for other beings rather than only for oneself, right? It's not other beings to the exclusion of oneself because there's no separation there. If we're working for all beings, we're included in that. So we also get the benefit of that wholesomeness and stability and progress and peace and all that. So teaching and guiding living beings, turning our attention away from being self-involved is how we stop getting caught up in the delusion of the grasping and the clinging and the three poisons and everything that goes with that. It's also how we keep from becoming discouraged and exhausted and fatigued and tired. So one of the stories that gets told about Suzuki Roshi is that somebody asked him one time, so I'm really, I'm feeling discouraged. What do I do about being discouraged? He said, encourage others. I think this is exactly what he's talking about. When we're feeling discouraged, fatigued, kind of at the end, what do? How about trying to help somebody else? And it seems counterintuitive, right? It seems like we're really at the end of our resources. The last thing we feel like we can do is help somebody else. And yet, right, we do that, we reconnect with this one unified reality, with all of the resources that come from being interconnected. The focus comes away from poor me and my situation, which doesn't mean we shouldn't deal with our situation, but if the focus can become, what about helping somebody else? Something good happens there, right? Some energy happens there. So when we're focused on small self, we're really cutting ourselves off from this network of interconnectedness. Well, actually, we can't cut ourselves off. We think we are, or we may feel like we are. There's no way to actually be cut off from that, but we stop seeing this big picture of reality, this one unified reality. When we do, we pretty quickly run out of resources because we think this five skandhas is all there is. I'm on my own with this because I'm not connected to anything. Well, no wonder I'm fatigued. No wonder I'm discouraged. So interestingly, the word exhaust means to drain, right? To drain something. So we're chasing and running and doing and using up all of our resources to get whatever it is we think we want. We're kind of draining ourselves dry, if you will. It feels like there's nothing more in the pipeline and there's nothing coming in. And actually, we're not separate from the network, right? So not cutting ourselves off from living beings and the rest of the universe is the reality of this moment. That pipeline's never actually cut off. It's never that there's nothing more there. So if I'm trying to impose my small self story onto reality and I'm kind of operating on that basis, then I'm always going to run into roadblocks because my small self story is not the whole story. So I'm always going to run into something, right? Refusing to acknowledge that my viewpoint isn't necessarily the way things work, it's the way I think things work with limited information, is the most basic cause, I think, of frustration and suffering, right? And sometimes we see others, we may see our friends or colleagues or something doing this. It's like they're operating on the basis of this very limited viewpoint and just want to say, but what about this thing? What about the rest of the story? And you can just see people getting frustrated, right? So I used to work for a regional government agency. I spent about 16 years working for a regional government agency. It was bigger than counties, but smaller than state. So it was kind of in the middle. it was one of the few places that actually had that kind of jurisdiction. Most places in the country don't have that. So it was formed because there are some elements of functioning that don't recognize human boundaries. You know, the kind of boundaries that we set. Here's a city, here's a county, right? Creeks and rivers and aquifers don't care that there's a county line or a city line. Roads and buses don't stop at the end of the city, right? The road goes on. People live in one city, they work in another city, they need somehow to make a daily commute, right? These things don't recognize humans drew a line and said, you know, this is Oakdale and this is Maplewood, right? So, but, you know, jurisdictions stop at that boundary. Budgets stop at that boundary. Enforcement stops at the boundary, right? So we have this kind of disconnect. So we're sort of trying to operate in a world that isn't actually the way the world functions. So, you know, a road would be pretty good up to a city or a county line, and then it would become terrible because this city would keep the roads up and this one didn't have the money or something, right? It's really interesting. Or an entire region would be using the groundwater, but one city somewhere is doing something that affects the water quality for everybody. Or major employers need workers, but somehow there's no affordable housing nearby. Or the buses don't run so that second and third shift workers can get to work because they're coming from somewhere else, right? So by creating a regional agency, this whole metro area then could see how everything was connected, how everything was affecting each other, whether they liked it or not. That was not always a smooth relationship. These were 7 counties that were trying to work together. So this was not always a smooth relationship. They had to find ways to agree to work together. And at the time, as I say, there were only 1 or 2 other regional agencies even kind of working this way. So keeping everything kind of siloed, refusing to acknowledge that those systems were already connected in some way just meant more frustration, right? People were working against each other. So that was a way to begin to figure out water flows, air moves, roads go on, right? If we ignore that, we ignore that at our peril. So I think it was successful mostly. It's still there as far as I know. So we're connected whether we like it or not, whether we refuse to acknowledge it or not. Sometimes, you know, I don't want to be a part of that thing. Well, guess what? The reality is this connection is already there. So recognizing the reality of that helps with this tendency to become tired, to become depleted and defeated, right? The reality is I'm going to keep hitting this wall unless I recognize what's going on. So we can stop working against what's really happening. We can also stop feeling alone in our activity, right? We're not little islands. We're already working together. So for us, Zazen is where we inquire into the nature of indulging sense pleasures, being tired. How do we navigate that? That's where we can really get into it, you know, what's going on. So Uchiyama Roshi says, so you have to realize that right now you are practicing Zazen and it is not the time for thinking. This is correcting your attitude, correcting your posture, letting the thoughts go, and returning to Zazen. This is called awakening from distraction and confusion. Another time you might be tired. Then you have to remind yourself that you are practicing Zazen right now, and it is not the time for sleeping. This is correcting your attitude, correcting your posture, really opening the eyes, and returning to Zazen. This is called awakening from dullness and fatigue. So he was pretty familiar with this dynamic. Zazen means awakening from distraction and confusion, and from dullness and fatigue, awakening to Zazen billions of times. The Zazen of living out this fresh and raw life means awakening the mind, certifying through practice billions of times. This is Shikantaza. So on one hand, it's not time for thinking, correcting your attitude and posture, letting go of thoughts, returning to Zazen. On the other hand, it's not time for sleeping. Correct your attitude and posture, really open your eyes, and return to Zazen. So, let go of thoughts, really open your eyes. So, on the one hand, give up your sex fantasies, wishing you were somewhere other than the Zendo, indulging sense pleasures, right? Give up the fantasies, wishing something else was going on, you were somewhere else doing something else, come back. On the other hand, stop coasting along, idly waiting for the bell to ring, re-engage in this moment and come back, right? Let go and come back, re-engage and come back. This is what's going on in Zazen. So Zazen is where we start dropping off body and mind and making ourselves available to all beings in this kind of effort to release ourselves from the distraction of small self, demands of small self. So we're not denying our own needs. This is not about mortification of the body. We're not denying our own needs and the things we need to do and the things we need to have in order to live in this world and function in this world in a day-to-day kind of way, in a healthy way. But we also know it's not the whole story. And swinging too far to one side or too far to the other side is not skillful, not helpful. So this gate, I think, is a great reminder that we don't just practice for the sake of others and leave ourselves out. And it's easy as bodhisattvas to think, well, it's all about these people. It's all about these beings, right? No. Anything we're doing for everybody is including ourselves. So, we don't just practice for the sake of others, just like we don't practice only for our own personal gain. So we can see from this gate statement, teaching and guiding living beings helps to support us as well. We're part of the living beings that are being taught and guided. So we get the chance to loosen the grip of those three poisons, and at the same time, for ourselves, and at the same time, we're engaged in beneficial action for other beings, for all beings. So what would you all like to say about anything in this gate or anything that's bubbling up for you? Maybe start with the people in the room. Let's see what's on your minds this morning. Anybody? Nobody wants to talk about your sex fantasies? Or anything else coming up in Zazen?
I guess I have a
Please.
question/comment. I think that as Buddhists, when we give this sort of teaching, we do always point this out that it's not about self-mortification. That we have to take care of the body and the self as well. But like in practice, does anyone really have that problem? I wonder, because it seems for people that really, at least outwardly are trying to do everything for other people, there's still kind of an ego thing there, right? Like,
sure.
Everyone look at me, how great I am, I'm doing everything for other people. So I sort of, part of me wonders if that can really be a problem. Like if you really are sincerely, serving others, can it ever really reach a state where it's unhealthy? I mean, if you're really doing it in a sincere way.
Yep.
So I just wonder what you think about that.
Well, that is exactly the question of compassion fatigue. So my friend Tomlin Mar, who's a doctor and works in palliative care and is also a transmitted teacher, deals with that a lot. Mm-hmm. She's like gone to conferences to talk about compassion fatigue. And it's exactly the way you've put it. If you're sincerely working for all beings without attachment to self and five skandhas, there is no fatigue there. There's no yardstick, right? It's just moment by moment doing that activity. If we're working for all beings with this little thing down here that says, and am I not a great bodhisattva because of what I'm doing? Or if I don't behave this way, others won't like me. Or this is the way I was raised in my family, I've always been a caretaker, therefore that's my identity. Fatigue, you bet. Because the pipeline will run dry. So you're right, it's not a problem if you're truly doing the bodhisattva work without attachment. You've truly opened the hand. Yeah. If you're doing it with this little bit of karmic consciousness mixed in there, you're going to get stuck. It's like the thorn in your shoe. It's just, you're going along, but you're going to get stuck a little bit. So I think that's exactly why we have to look carefully at where fatigue is coming from, because we can tell ourselves we're doing everything right. I'm working for all beings. Isn't this a wonderful thing? I used to become extremely frustrated because many years ago, I would try to go to morning zazen, like every morning, and it was the problem was parking, because this place didn't have great parking. And so I would park at work and walk. But when I did that, I was not actually parking in a way that my employer sanctioned, and they would come after me for parking. And in my mind I think, but I'm parking in order to sit zazen. I mean, I'm doing this for the benefit of all beings. How can they come after me? Of course, you can't make that case to an employer, right? I was like, but no! So, there's this little bit of thing down here that says, but they should let me because I'm a great bodhisattva and I'm going to, I'm parking here in order to do Zen practice. What could be better than that? So yeah, we get to think about that because it's really subtle, right? It's really subtle. I mean, this is why, practice is a lifelong activity because there's always something we can encounter. The thing I think we have to be careful about is we see that little bit of self-clinging and then we think, oh, I shouldn't be doing this activity at all. And that's not it. Oh, this is tainted, therefore I shouldn't be doing it at all. No, we do it anyway because it's beneficial action. But we also get to work with this little bit of attachment down here and see where does that come from? How does it arise? How is it manifesting? Is it keeping me from fully engaging in some way, right? So you make a really good point, and it is very subtle. We need to have aspiration, we need to aim at something, but then we get to look at all the places we get stuck, right, along the way. So if we're dealing with something like compassion fatigue, one of the recommendations is you look at where are you stuck in your own kind of stuff. Because dealing with compassion fatigue also doesn't mean, well, we ignore the fact that we're exhausted because it's a pandemic and we've been working, 16-hour days for weeks and weeks and weeks. That's also not healthy if we can avoid doing that, right? So, it's a balance, right? It's one of the reasons this practice is a challenge. We can't just look at a list and go, oh, this, right? Karmic circumstances are changing all the time. So we get to have that spirit of inquiry that says, okay, I'm feeling something, feeling some suffering here, what's going on? Thank you for bringing that up. Do you have a follow-up or anything to add?
No, I just, it's interesting that you mentioned the compassion fatigue, and I'm remembering when that person, I think, gave a workshop or something, I remember sort of scoffing and being like, no one really has compassion fatigue.
Oh, they do.
But I think that you're right, it depends on how you interpret, what that means. So yeah, as you mentioned, if there's that little yardstick there, then yeah, you can definitely have it. But yeah, I guess I was just thinking this sort of unrealistic, idealized version of compassion. So.
Well, we feel like we're giving all the time. Giving, I've got nothing left.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be true. I mean, there might be real fatigue there, and we need to look at that carefully. Because if we're not, that's called martyrdom, and that's an ego trip.
Right.
That's, I have some idea about who I am in the midst of my giving and my for-embracing actions and all that stuff, right? And again, doesn't mean we shouldn't be taking that action, but what are we clinging to? There's some reward there. I'm looking for some reward out of my giving. So what little kind of sticky thing is in there that we need to be careful about? So, yeah. Other things folks would like to raise this morning, please.
So I'm not even sure if this is quite a question, but it's an observation that your
That's good.
talk has made me aware of, and it might just be me, but something that I've kind of noticed is that how I interact in terms of compassion with others is tied to whether or not I will have to interact with that person in the future. And I don't care about embarrassing myself in public or around strangers because I'll likely never see that person again. And, but with friends, I'm very cautious about, all of this stuff. And similarly, it's if I feel like I can help a stranger, give money, buy something from a gas station to feed them or something like that, I just feel good about it. I don't feel any negative feelings. But when it comes to a friend, I overthink how they're going to remember me for this. Are they going to think that this was a lazy gift? It was oh, it only was $5, things like that. And I'm sort of, I guess, thinking in terms of the idea of community and how we emphasize Sangha a lot, and how it actually seems like Sangha has become more important to Buddhism over time. Possibly because these attachments can be kind of awkward, but at the same time maybe it's just something we have to work through. I don't know, but I guess just the more I'm thinking, it's oh yeah, I really do just overthink any interaction if I'm a part of a community, but it also just feels like we need community. I don't know.
Well, we do need community, and there's no question that considering our relationships is important, right? So it's certainly useful to try to maintain good relationships with people, and I guess the part of that gets sticky is, how do people think about this one? How do people think about these 5 skandhas? So am I acting for the benefit of everybody? Or is this little thing down here that says I'm going to do something so people will like me or think well of me or give me something back later or something. That's the human condition. I mean, there's a certain way in which we can't kind of beat ourselves up for that because that's what humans do. And certainly some kind of cooperation is important in a community. I mean, there's some mutuality that has to happen there. I help you today, you help me tomorrow. You know, that's the way community works. It becomes a problem if we're getting stuck, and we know we're running around doing things for people simply so we have some kind of image, you know. So there's always going to be that little bit of self-clinging. I think the important part of what you're raising, though, is simply awareness and spirit of inquiry into how we're keeping the health of those relationships. So are we, as the third precept, you know, kind of points to, are we using people for what the small self can get out of that, or are we acting for the benefit of everybody? And there are very few times where that's a completely pure action. Right? There's almost always some little bit of something in here that says, I feel good because of what I did. So part of our practice is watching that happen and seeing the roots of that, right? And simply paying attention to it, moving toward the most wise and compassionate and skillful kind of action we can take. Right? But yeah, being in community is a challenge. It's one of the reasons that Sangha is important, not only because we get support from the Sangha, but it's a real opportunity to see our practice reflected back amongst people who are also on this path with this same kind of aspiration, so we can really help each other and point out things and understand. Like if you went, you know, into a shopping center and said what you just said, people would go, I have no idea what you're talking about. And when you say it here, everybody totally gets what you're talking about. Right? So we're all kind of helping each other see clearly, practice compassionately. This is really the place where we can learn to do that in a really kind of intensive way so that we can then take that practice into the world in a way that makes sense, because others aren't going to have the same expectation that we have of each other as practitioners, right? So it's a bit of a challenge. It's why Sangha can feel like a refuge, right? Sangha is one of the refuges because we get it. We understand the Bodhisattva vow here, you know? And then how do we figure out together how to take that into the world, I think is something important that you're raising. So it starts with our own personal relationships. Yeah, important stuff.
This is making me think that, like, the more that, like, philosophical exploration of the Dharma has become more complicated, the more Sangha has been necessary.
Yeah, well, that's true. Why? Because it's all here, right? We can read a lot of books and do a lot of this. Where the rubber meets the road is you're sitting next to somebody in the zendo, or you're eating a meal across from somebody during sesshin, or, right? I mean, you know, this is where it really becomes concrete. And as I said in the very beginning, teaching and guiding living beings is mostly about what are we embodying? What are we carrying into the world? You know, if I see that your hands are full, do I take one of your packages for you? That's bodhisattva activity, right? And it's as simple as that. So yes, we can get caught up in a lot of philosophical whatever, and it's not that that's bad, but it's not the whole story, and it's not the entirety of how we teach and guide living beings, which is what we vowed to do. You know, when you took precepts, that's what you vowed to do. So the concrete reality is an important piece. It's just as important, right? So I can sit up here and say a lot of stuff. I'm not helping you until you get off the cushion and go out into the world and try to practice with whatever you're practicing with, right? What would others like to say?
Let's open it up to the gallery.
Oh, well, Sawyer first, because he had something to say.
So I'm thinking about peace and progress and dullness and distract thinking and sleeping. So I want to get kind of like up close and granular about sesshin a little bit.
Ah, okay.
Like during this past sesshin, one thing that I was noticing is like this, I mean, I probably fell asleep and woke up like hundreds
A million
of
times. Welcome to Sesshin.
and just like, you know, there would be these, I thought of it as like micro dreaming. Like just for an instant, some strange image appears that where did that come from? Has nothing, no relation seemingly to anything. But then you just and then I would like immediately forget it. And that would happen in the space of like 10 seconds sometimes, where you're off and then you're back. And somehow there was energy to just continue doing that, and some kind of trust that something as mundane and strange and boring as just, that billions of times returning is actually what we're here to do.
Yep.
So I guess the question is how to maintain a sense that that activity has some kind of, does it have some kind of worth, or is it how to maintain motivation to continue?
Mm-hmm.
It's just some random,
Yeah, well, so as soon as we hold a yardstick up to that, now we're judging and labeling and saying this is meaningful, this is not meaningful. Whereas if we're not holding your yardstick up to that, it's simply the moment-by-moment activity that you experienced, right? So this is the arising and dissipating and the brain working but not grabbing, not grabbing those thoughts, you're not grabbing those micro dreams and writing a story, right? So you're just seeing this functioning, right? This is just the life force functioning. And as soon as we don't obstruct it and get in the way of it, we don't become fatigued. We put a lot of energy into grabbing. It takes so much energy into holding onto what I think this five skandhas is, and trying to get to a goal and grabbing onto something as it goes by. That just takes so much energy. And if we stop doing that, right, somehow we're not drained in the same way, and it's just this life force functioning. So we don't have to consider, is this meaningful or not? Is it useful or not? Right? Is it beneficial or not? Because all of that's a yardstick. There just simply is what's going on, right? So it sounds like you were able, at least for a short period of time, to not have a measurement, not have a comparison, which is what we do in Zazen. We open the hand, we drop the yardsticks and the rulers and the comparisons and the measuring and the labeling and the judging and right? We just let life force function. Zazen is doing Zazen. We don't have to have an opinion about that. It's kind of a relief, right? You sit down in front of the wall and you don't have to justify yourself while you're sitting in front of the wall. Your friends and neighbors and family might wonder, what the hell are you doing? But in that moment, you don't need to have a reason to do that. This is what I'm doing now. I'm sitting in front of a wall. And I'm just letting what happens happen. And you don't need a reason to do that. And we don't need to decide if that's meaningful or useful or good use of time. And as we know in Sesshin, we sort of lose track of time anyway. We don't know how long we've been sitting there. Has it been one period or 15 periods? Has it been 10 minutes or, has it been 50 or how long is it? What day is this? I often don't know what day it is anymore. I have to look at the calendar, the schedule, and say, who had work period this day? Okay, it must be Wednesday. I have no idea. Because we just sort of stop measuring, and when we stop measuring, then we don't have to have an opinion. I think it's a big relief not to have to have an opinion about stuff. It takes a lot of energy to have all those opinions. I had that experience, I'm sure I've told the story, I had that experience in Shogoji years ago. I was there in June. It would happen to be June, part of the time I was there. On the 1st of June, it's like somebody flips a switch and the rain starts. And it's like living under a waterfall for 30 days. It's dark, it's wet, your stuff will not dry before it mildews. In the back of your cupboard, I pulled out my shoes that I hadn't worn in a month. They were green. Oh my goodness. And then July 1, somebody flips a switch and the rain stops and the sun comes out and it's beastly hot. And you just think, what am I doing here? There were plenty of times at Shogoji, not only the weather, but just, it was the first time I'd been in a training temple. It's hard. It's a language I didn't speak, culture I didn't know. I was away from home for a while. And I just thought, if there was a plane in the front yard, I'd get on it. Man, I'd be out of here, And at the same time, I was thinking, well, but people might wonder why I'm doing this and thinking it's not a good idea. But even though I'm suffering now, I know something good is happening, and later on I'm going to figure out why this was meaningful and why this was helpful. And I know that in the end I'll be glad I did it. And I lived that way for quite a while, and that's how I kind of got along. And then one day, suddenly I woke up and said, this doesn't have to be okay. I was trying to make it okay. Well, I'm justifying it because although this is, seems ridiculous now, there will be some good in it for me at some point. And one day I said, wait a minute, this doesn't have to be okay. I just have to do it. Whew. I mean, I could like physically feel less tired. I could feel how much energy was going into holding on to the justification for doing that practice. I didn't have to justify it. So once we can drop the measuring, that's what they're talking about, right? So it sounds like you had some insight into that a little bit.
Yeah, that
It doesn't have to be okay.
it doesn't have to be okay,
Mm-mm.
or it doesn't have to feel okay to me personally.
Mm-mm.
But then also to not feel like then you're just forcing yourself through something
Yeah,
that's unhealthy.
right. Because that's not good either.
But it's just saying this is what's happening.
Right.
Uh,
So I think there are two things that would keep us. So you're looking for motivation. You're looking for why would we keep going. So one is, of course, within Sanchen style, the kind of practice that we do, we're solely relying on bodhicitta. So we're not relying on any kind of curriculum to pull us through, any kind of teacher expectation to pull us through, any kind of idea who we are to pull us through. We're simply relying on bodhicitta. Something's getting us on the cushion that says awakening, 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 awakening. The other is that we have teachers and Sangha and Dharma brothers and sisters and centuries of tradition that say this is a meaningful, wholesome practice. There's something beneficial that comes out of this practice. So Zazen is good for nothing doesn't mean Zazen has no result, right? So after all these centuries of people practicing together and all of us looking around to say we can draw inspiration from each other, we're pretty sure this is a good thing to do. Even if in this moment my back hurts and my knees hurt and I don't want to be here, I'm pretty sure this is a good thing to do. I can have enough trust in that to keep with it. If we're walking into a practice situation that we really feel is unhealthy, we need to be careful about that. And they exist because we're humans. Human communities can go off the rails. I've seen it happen. Then we have to think carefully about what container am I putting myself into. But overall, we can say, I think this is a meaningful, wholesome, beneficial thing to do, so I'm going to stick with it. I don't have to be okay with it in this moment. And my aspiration, my bodhicitta says, get on the cushion, or do the study, or whatever the practice is, right? So somehow those things all come together and push us forward in a certain kind of way, right? But it's not something external that's pulling us. We can look for those things, but you won't get them here. We don't have those things here. We just have Zazen. Other things from you or from folks at home? We'll open it up to the gang. Anyone at home have something to say or ask today? Reflections, comments?
Hey, Hoko.
Hi, Futatsu.
Hey, Fusats. Yeah. This was really. I was telling Jigen, I was like, this talk is so spot on. Having been like traveling last week to a busy city and being in the container of a high pressure environment, looking at our 23 schedule, perspective was something that really came up for me in your talk. And being attached to really, the things that, in your job, you have to be attached to the goal, right? But again, even with that, not being attached to it as holistically, it's this big picture of crazy. And then you get yourself stressed out about it. And I just had a moment where I'm just like, it just stopped. I just stopped and just kind of like, I can only do one thing at a time and one thing in a moment. Mm-hmm. So, I'm walking back from the job, on the street in New York, it's so busy. And I just had a moment there and I was just kind of like, yeah, you realize how attached we are to everything, in our moments of time. But again, that perspective, what you were talking about, Hoko was very helpful. Because again, it allows you to kind of see kind of your reference point and your attachments at any given moment. So, that was very helpful for me. And again, like I said, it was just kind of like, I felt like I was in a work sesshin this week, in a container for like 10, 12 hours a day. But again, even in that, in every single moment, you have to realize like it can become so overwhelming. Just like what Doji was saying, I work for a healthcare organization, and you try to keep perspective on the things that you're building and trying to do it for the benefit of people. But if the people that are doing the work trying to have benefit are totally exhausted, that's not helpful either. So I mean, it is a balance in every single moment that we're trying to maintain. So at any given moment, we're just trying to do the best we can as bodhisattvas, I think. So I just had to share that, and I really appreciate this talk. It was so spot on. I'll be sitting with this for weeks on end, but thank you for your teaching.
Oh, not at all. Well, so if we know every time we have an attachment, we're probably going to create suffering. Anytime we're feeling uncomfortable, uneasy, what are we attached to? Well, it can be hard when what we're sort of being told to be attached to is a schedule from somebody else, right? The boss gives us a schedule, or there's something we don't have control over, right? I can't realistically do this thing. And yet I'm told I'm supposed to be attached to it, right? That's a really interesting place to practice. And there isn't an easy answer for that. So if in that moment we can at least see what's going on, my suffering is happening because I'm attached to this thing, which I may or may not have control over. Maybe we can do maybe we can see a little bit clearly around that. So.
It's not unlike our vows.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Well, so the next thing out of my mouth was going to be, and isn't that exactly what we vow to do as bodhisattvas, right? Here's an unrealistic thing we've been given. Go through every Dharma gate, realize every possible part of this practice, save every being, human or not. Well, we can't do it. It takes more than forever. Somebody else gave, the boss, Buddha gave us a schedule and said, here you go. Here's your assignment. We went, So how do we function in that place? That can be an uncomfortable place. So if we can bring that same mind to the rest of work, that's an interesting approach, isn't it? To let go when we have to let go. And sometimes we just have to say, realistically, I and my team can't do this. We need to find, we need to manage scope. Goodness knows people here are tired of hearing me talk about managing scope as compared to resources, so we have to be careful. Other things from folks at home? Questions, comments, reflections? Things you'd like to share?
I have a question, Hoko.
Okay.
So, how do we practice with laziness?
Laziness.
For example, like I'm generally lazy. I don't feel motivated even at work. It's hard for me to motivate myself to do my own tasks. Now, going out and helping others is like even a step ahead, further. Even though I understand we do it as bodhisattvas and all of that, it's hard to see the interconnection. It's more easier to see like how they're like twofold, right? Like one is how do I overcome this energy of laziness and still go and do for others when I don't feel that motivation for doing my own stuff. And the point is like when I don't see the interconnection, it's more easy to see how things affect me. Like it's very immediate if I have something for my own self versus others. It's hard to see like how that interconnection is actually benefiting, or hard to see the interconnection. How do I motivate myself to this? Or
Yeah, well, so if we're feeling lazy, we're attached to something. If I'm feeling lazy, I'm attached to not getting out of bed, not getting up out of my chair, whatever that is. So if I can see that, and I mean, I fall prey to this, so does everybody. I have dishes to wash, I don't want to do it. I need to vacuum the carpet, I don't want to do it. I need to go to the bank, I don't want to do it. So I'm attached to something. This small self is getting some kind of a reward for that. So instead, can I turn the focus this way and say, what would I be doing if I wasn't attached to the needs of small self at this moment? Well, there's something about taking care of my dishes or taking care of my carpet, which is helping other beings, simply because I'm not solely focused on what does this small self, 5 skandhas, want. There's something about that which is good practice for bodhisattva activity. So, I may not want to get up and do whatever it is, but as soon as I break the preoccupation of small self, it feels easier to get up and do that thing, right? So, if I don't want to get up out of bed, The moment I get up out of bed, I've done it. I don't have to worry about it anymore. The moment I get up and get out the vacuum cleaner, I don't have to worry about it anymore. So I've kind of taught myself to practice with that stuff in that way. You know, if you just get up out of the chair and do it, you can stop putting your energy into fighting against, I don't want to do this or this or this or this, right? So it's not easy to just say, well, magically I'm going to motivate myself in this way or that way. But if we consider the action, even the simple things, the washing the dishes, you know, the watering the plants, the going out to buy the groceries, whatever we need, as being not so much focused on small self and the need to just do nothing, and instead to be an active kind of practice, it feels like there's some meaning there. It's more meaningful if I'm saying my practice at this moment is to cut the grass than if I'm in my chair going, I don't want to get up and cut the grass, right? So there's no magic answer for that, but I'm going to suggest a shift of perspective that says, you know, my laziness might be about attachment to something here, and what am I attached to? What reward am I getting for not doing that thing? And then can we bring sort of bodhicitta to that and say, well, if I consider everything I'm doing as a practice, and I get the opportunity to practice all day long, which we do, right? We don't have to be in the zendo all day. Everything we're doing all day long is practice. So if we're really committed to practice, then all of our actions are practice. So if I get up off the chair and I cut the grass, I'm doing lawn mowing zazen. I'm doing some kind of practice activity, which is meaningful and beneficial simply because I'm doing it without an opinion about it. I'm doing it without an attachment to me or to the job. I'm simply doing it because that's the next thing we're doing. So can we sort of put ourselves in the zazen of the whole world, I'm sorry, in the zendo of the whole world in that moment and just say, this is my practice right now. It's not easy, but it might be one way to begin to shift that a little bit. Other things from anybody today?
I
Hoshin.
just wanted to tag on to what you were
Yeah,
just
please.
talking about. It's the fact for me that when we do sesshin, and often doing zazen, it's often about, I don't want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that I battle against that, just personally, and it's kind of a Ram Dass thing, is I try and get curious about it.
Oh, absolutely. Engage with
Whatever thing I'm going through, whatever my mind's doing,
Mhm.
whatever discomfort there is, or try and get curious about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And laziness is something to be curious about.
Interesting,
Yeah.
yes. So if we bring that spirit of inquiry to it, what's going on? That's a hindrance that's keeping me from doing this thing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting when you don't want to do zazen to then become engaged with, okay, not in an intellectual way, right? But just to drop the small self that's saying, I don't want to do this, and say, what's actually going on, you know? Because zazen is a whole interesting movie if we if we take it that way, right? Good. Other things this morning from anybody?
I guess sort of one final.
Please. Oh, okay. So gallery first and then doju. Is that you, Jigen?
Yeah, thanks. Just jumping off of what Hoshin said and what Mahesh said, what I found helpful is to really explicitly lean on the three minds. You know, when I'm really struggling and I'll ask myself, well, I know there's got to be some joyful mind here, you know, and if there really isn't, if I really can't find it, you know, there's nurturing mind. And, you know, really to kind of explicitly take those three minds and practice with them, especially when you're struggling, I have found really helpful and really, you know, it's just the name of our Sangha, you know, the name is in itself a support and a practice. And so I just wanted to add that on top of what Hoshin had said.
Well, I think that's really helpful because it gives us a structure for that spirit of inquiry, right? Now we have some tools to investigate without getting caught up in the intellectual piece. But now we have some tools to sort of investigate what's going on here. Is there kind mind? Is there joyful mind? Is there big mind? So for those who don't know about the three minds, that comes from Dogen's Tenzo Kyokan, so you can look up and read a little bit about that. Yeah, thank you for that. That's helpful. And you had a follow-up as well?
Yeah, and Jigen actually used the word that I had in mind. So in opening the Hand of Thought, the chapter on Sesshin, you know, one of the teachings that I find really helpful is he talks about struggling. You know, like when we do sesshin, we find ourselves struggling to be comfortable, struggling
Oh,
to,
yes, we do.
you know, have a clear mind, struggling to do whatever. And of course, we do this every day in our lives. Anytime we encounter anything that we don't like, we struggle against it. So laziness is another example, of course. We're struggling to do something, but we don't want to do it, and there's this struggle.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what he says, Ujiyama Roshi, is, you know, sesshin is a practice of giving up that struggle. So, like, yeah, I'm uncomfortable, my mind is racing, but I'm just going to give up and not, you know, sort of try to do anything. And I feel like, you know, in sesshin, when, of course, that itself is temporary. You know, you might be able to let go of struggle for a second, but you have to come back to it billions of times. But when you do that, that's, I think, for me at least, when sesshin feels really right, is when you can give up that struggle and just sit there with your discomfort and not fight, rage against it, you know. So.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it takes 14 periods a day to get to that point, doesn't it? Because for the first 13, I don't want to be here. My back doesn't want to be here, right? There's things I want to do. There's work I have to do. And when we back ourselves into the corner where we just say, but I've committed to sit here for 5 days, am I going to like struggle like this for 5 days? I'm going to be exhausted. It's like, phew, open the hand. Oh, you know? So yeah, it's like when I was at Shogoji and just said, I don't have to be okay with this. You know, and we're sitting sesshin, I don't have to be okay with this. I have to get up and cut the grass, I don't have to be okay with it. Because it's amazing how much energy we put into that struggle, and when we drop the struggle, you can really feel it. At least I can. It sounds like you as well. Whew, man, that's exhausting to be struggling against my life all the time. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be taking action and, you know, working to improve things and all of that. It's just, if I'm struggling against it because I want something that can't happen or isn't going to happen or isn't realistic, oh my gosh, yeah, that's fatiguing. So can I drop the struggle and still do the activity? That's a really interesting intersection, isn't it? I don't have to be okay with this. It's like a really important teaching. Other things this morning? Okay. My goodness, 11:30. We had a good discussion today. So we need to take a few minutes to set up for world peace following our chant, so please hang around for that. Thank you for a good discussion this morning.